We must simply, whenever we've been injured, harmed, loss of loved ones, property, homeland, and so forth, we simply have to forgive those who have injured us, bear no hostility, recognize that the Chinese are our brothers and sisters, and frankly, what's ripened upon us is simply the result of past karma. Now, there's no fatalism here. It's not fate, it's not God. It's simply, in some past lives, the seeds were sown. Here we're reaping the harvest of that. And so we've contributed to this. And so now simply be present with what's here and let's make the best of it, but do not follow the route of hostility, vengeance, self-pity, and all of that. And that was a uniform voice from all of those who are the role models. You know, that has a big impact on the society.
Yeah. And it must have been around this time you started to first meditate, was that correct?
I started meditating already in Germany.
Okay.
I picked up a book on just very basic but very meaningful practices of mindfulness for the cultivation of contemplative insight. So I started there, but of course it really got into gear.
So when you first meditated, how did you find it?
As something of basically limitless promise.
Limitless promise.
Yes.
Okay.
And that is not just, oh, I believe someday this will turn out well. That's just basically blind faith. But I started meditating, it must have been an hour or two a day already while living in Germany. And I found this really is bringing me to a deeper insight into truth and serenity. So it's not only giving insight, but this is like tilling the field of the mind, of the spirit, of the heart.
Yeah.
And so this was going to be a keeper. This is going to be something I do at least for the rest of my life. And that was just self-taught. I picked up a really good book called The Heart of Buddhist Meditation. That just spoke to me. It was intelligent, it was grounded, very sensible. So I started practicing that. But for pretty much from day one, when we started receiving instruction by the lamas in Dharamsala, India, well, of course, meditation's right there. It's right up front.
Yeah.
And so then that became much more prominent. A year and a half after I arrived, I took ordination as a monk. So for the last 40 years, meditation has been an absolutely indispensable element of my daily life.
Yes, many people, when they start to meditate, especially in the West, they find it very hard. But for you, there must have been difficulties, but that commitment was there, and you saw the potential somehow.
And for me, as soon as I went to India, I went there for only one reason. I didn't go there to find a new girlfriend or to start a new career. There was only one reason, and there was a lot of sacrifice involved. So I never had any romantic relationship from that time on until many, many years later, after I'd been a monk for 14 years, living in the West, and feeling if I'm going to stay in the West now, after 14 years as a monk, this is not a monastic environment. And this is really a fish out of water.
Yes.
So then very deliberately and following the proper protocols, what was it, 1987, so many years had gone by, and years of training as a monk, and years of just devoting myself single-pointedly to meditation, years. Then I felt, now we're really skipping ahead, but now it's 1987, so I've had 14 years of living with Tibetans in India, I lived in Sri Lanka, I lived in Switzerland.
You also spent time on long retreats on your own, didn't you?
Yes, I did. From 1980 to the end of 1983. There was only one. By that time, I'd had 10 solid years of training.
Yes.
And I'd become fluent in the language. I was already a teacher since 1976. I was something of a scholar. I'd been studying straight out for 10 years. But after 10 years of that, all of the 70s, basically.
What did you learn from those long retreats on your own? How was that for you?
Well, this for me was a time of assimilation. And that is, there's a lot of learning and acculturation, immersing myself in a new culture, learning a whole new worldview, a new set of values and so forth, that was quite alien from growing up in California. And so a lot of knowledge acquisition. The meditation then was a time to say, all right, what I've learned is a springboard for going deeper into experience.
It's a kind of integration in one way.
It was a profound integration, And then just going, again, using teachings, not to indoctrinate myself in them, but using, like a Buddhist metaphor is the finger pointing to the moon. Well, I knew exactly where that finger was pointing after 10 years, and I just wanted to look at the moon. So this was really probing inwards, looking into the very nature of consciousness. And I spent pretty close to 4 years in just one contemplative solitary retreat after another.
And what did you find about the nature of consciousness as you look more and more in?
That the potentials are infinite.
Yeah.
The notion transpersonal just leaps to mind, trans-individual. An experiential sense that what we regard as our psyche, you're a man as opposed to a woman, I too, with a certain ethnic background, linguistic background, personal history background, I would put that whole dimension of mind, I would label that psyche. And that's a perfectly good, legitimate area of study, and that's what psychologists study. And many people think mentally or spiritually or conscious-wise, that's all there is to us. Well, it becomes evident when you put in 5, 10, 15,000 hours of meditation that that's the surface level. And it's where many of us simply, how do you say, throw the anchor of our sense of identity. I'm really a man. I'm really an American. I'm not a Brit. I'm really an American, like as if that's in my core. Well, that's not in my core. That's simply an acculturation. Penetrate through that level, and you penetrate to a dimension of consciousness that no longer has a personal history. It's beyond personal history.
So you're going through these levels then. Let's have a look at these levels so we can understand this more clearly. Right. So what would be like the top level?
The top level I would simply call by the familiar term psyche, because I think it's precisely what psychologists study. And if we go back to Freud, this includes both the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. And both of them are heavily acculturated by our personal history, language, and so forth, and genetics and brain chemistry, right? So a myriad of influences. So that's that dimension, and that is certainly worthy of very, very careful scrutiny, study. A lot of our mental distress emerges from that level. And moreover, as we cultivate the psyche, like cultivating a field, we can bring much greater balance, health, buoyancy, and so forth, sanity, to the psyche, such that even the surface level of the mind can be really wholesome, sane, and can then more and more, we can taste it for ourselves, we can find that our minds themselves can be the very wellspring of our own well-being. And I think this is one of the most important.
So there is a great value in that, but it is the surface as such.
It is the surface, but even there, it's not something to dismiss or disparage.
Yes, no, I understand.
Because this is where most people are living most of the time. And to recognize that the whole domain there, let's put it this way. If you put an ordinary person into a room and give them all the food they need, and it's warm, it's comfortable, keep in a room for 24 hours, but with no telly, no magazines, nothing to read, no entertainment, no one to talk to. Just say, here's the room, here's your food, there's a toilet when you need it. We'll see you in 24 hours. For most people, that's not going to be a happy day.
No, that would be very challenging.
That'd be very, and what's happened here in that kind of scenario, it's called solitary confinement, is suddenly in those 24-hour period, and it will dawn on them very quickly, there's no buffer zone between them and their minds. And so the more imbalanced the mind is, the more prone it is to anxiety, frustration, a neurosis, and so forth, then the more miserable you're going to be with no outside help. That is, the mind can make you abjectly miserable with no input from the environment. That's a pretty important discovery. And it tapers, it encourages to ease off when we're feeling really unhappy, to whip the finger out and say, oh, it's because of my spouse, my girlfriend, my boyfriend, my boss, the neighbors, the car, the weather, and so forth, the politicians. We whip out the finger so quickly to attribute the source of our unhappiness, dissatisfaction, and so forth to someone else, and therefore they've got to fix themselves. And then rarely recognizing that, as they say, when one finger points out, 4 point back in. That the fundamental source of anxiety, distress, and so forth is in our own minds. Now take another person who's, let's say, spent, a moderately decent period of time meditating, cultivating the mind. I would say I'm one of those people. I'm one of many people like that. But if you tell me, Alan, tomorrow we found a room for you, you're going to spend 24 hours in that room alone. I say, well, thank you. How much do I have to pay?
Okay. So below that, what's the level below that?
Below that, I'll give a name to it. Because happily, we're not the first generation to raise these questions and to devote ourselves in a very intensive way to exploring it experientially. In other words, this is not a catechism. This is not simply rehearsing some religious belief or metaphysical doctrine. But it is a matter of what William James, a great American psychologist, called radical empiricism. And that is take your immediate experience very seriously. When other people tell you it's all hallucination and so forth, don't buy into that. What you see is what you get. Let's look at that experience directly, take it seriously, and there we are. When you put in some hundreds or even thousands of hours, looking within, probing within, and doing it 8, 10 hours a day, and I've done that for actually years,